Hello, welcome. So this is the Prime Global Forum finance session at prime time. My name is Rose Liao, and I'm Associate Professor of Finance at Rutgers University. And I'm also the editor-in-chief of Emerging Markets Review, which is a journal that mainly looks at emerging markets finance. I will serve as the moderator of today's panel. And we are here together with world-renowned, not including me, of course, 5 world-renowned business finance educators to engage in a thought-provocative dialogue and discussion on how to make finance work for society, and especially how we could help as educators in advancing the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal. I don't think any of our panelists need an introduction. They have been champions of responsible business education through thought leadership, research, output, and teaching excellence. So I feel very, very honored to be here to moderate this discussion. So let me just go around. I have a brief introduction, and if you want to know more, you can always click on the resource button to see their full bios. We have Peter Tufano, the Baker Foundation professor at Harvard Business School and the Dean Emeritus at Oxford Said Business School. We have Knut Harnes, the London Sustainability Chair at IMD in Switzerland, and the Dean of Global Leadership Institute at the World Economic Forum, a former partner at the Boston Consulting Group. We have Martin Kaspersik, Professor of Finance at Imperial College London, the Managing Editor at Review of Finance, a top academic finance journal. We have Lawrence Swinkels, Associate Professor of Finance at Erasmus University Rotterdam, who has been leading research teams at various large institutional investors, most recently at Robeco. And finally, we have Farooq Landana, Dean's Professor of Finance at my own institution, Rutgers University, who has been leading the top-ranked executive MBA program for decades. So please join me in welcoming all of our panelists who have taken precious time out of their very busy schedule to join us at this forum to exchange ideas on responsible management education in general and financial education in particular. The goal for today's session is to have the best, of course, and honest discussions and on how we can transform management education through research, teaching, and thought leadership. What we'll do is every speaker will spend about 5 to 10 minutes expressing their views and share their initiatives to both enrich business education, but more importantly, to drive changes in our schools, in society. And think of this as our 30,000-foot view of the world, and we'll spend the second half of this webinar on Q&A. Our panelists would love to hear from all of you. So while they are engaging in their introduction, please put your questions in the chat box, put your questions in the Q&A. It would be great if you can state your name and your role in your institution with a short question, and the panelist name if your question is directed to a specific panelist. Without further ado, let's start our conversation with Professor Peter Tufano. Peter, it's all yours.
Great. Well, thank you, Rose, and thank you all for being part of this important discussion. Different ones of us have different abilities to do things based on our roles. So we can all do research, and there are lots of great researchers here. Many of us find ourselves in classes where we can teach so that our students or executives can learn more. And sometimes you find yourself in an administrative role, which I have done. So I think, if I may, since I worked with Knut on one project, which is something called Business Schools for Climate Leadership, and with Marcin on another, maybe I'll talk, if it's okay with you, Marcin, a little bit about our joint venture to try to train the next generation of doctoral students. Maybe later on I can talk about some of the things that we tried to do at Oxford and Harvard, but I think this is a nice collaborative way to start this conversation. As a dean, or as one of the limitations on the amount that we can teach our students and our executives about climate finance is that we need to have professors who are trained to do that. Marcin's a great example, one of the world leaders in this field, but not everybody's Marcin. And we need, hundreds more Marcins out there. But where are they going to come from? And so about 2 years ago, this time, I was casting around to figure out, and Rose, can you hear me okay? I just want to make sure. Good.
Yes.
And I thought that I would, solicit opinions from other places to figure out what they were doing. And much to my surprise, everybody said the same thing. This is a great idea, but maybe we don't do it yet because there wasn't enough demand, or maybe just the time wasn't right. And so a group of 8 of us got together and we began to teach a course called The Financial Economics of Climate and Sustainability. In the first year to students at 15 schools, and last year to students at 130 schools. I think what it showed are 2 or 3 things. One, there is a tremendous demand, by young scholars to learn more in this field. We had over almost 1,000 students sign up and a couple of hundred complete this past year. Secondly, there's tremendous reservoir of goodwill and skills amongst senior academics. So our teaching group includes not only myself and Marcin, but this year 8 others, including Johanna Strobel and Laura Starks and Jeff Heel and Carolyn. So many others, many others. And the third thing is that, given the current state of play in the finance literature, kind of encouraging a small number of doctoral students to do work can really have a material impact. And so one of the things that, happened a few weeks ago that was very satisfying in this respect is that the 6 schools who had joined FECS from the Netherlands got together and they had a doctoral consortium where they had students from each of their schools presenting their work. I think it's just a good example of how, even in our day-to-day work, we can push forward more research, more teaching, more development of young faculty, young scholars in order to move the field forward. And each of them will write papers and teach and do much more. So maybe I'll just stop there as an example of how already a few of us have gotten together and, let our competitive instincts maybe be suppressed for a little bit and collaborate, something Knut and I can talk about, or Knut can talk about, in order to really move forward this conversation. So thank you.
Thank you, Peter. I love that initiative that you're trying to help the next generation of educators. I think that's where the impact, when we talk about impact, that's where the impact begins. Since you mentioned Knut and Marcin, so let's go to Knut next, and then Marcin.
Okay.
Warm up, guys.
Thank you, Peter. And thank you so much for inviting me, Rose. Can you hear me okay? Super. So first of all, I want to say that we're educators, but in a way we also have to be leaders. We have to shape the agenda. We have to put ourselves out there. And just to kind of credit Peter Tufano a little bit on this, I think you have really shown leadership in terms of, you mentioned that Rose doctoral students, which is big and really has, I think, tremendous impact, but also what you mentioned, Peter, the collaboration between 8 business schools in Europe. And now, not only in Europe, Middle East as well, it will happen in Asia too. So I think it's spreading. And the idea of collaboration is important here. Because sustainability, I think, is an area where we can't do it alone. We have to collaborate, and we have to teach our students and also work with executives on how to collaborate on creating bigger, more systemic type solutions. And Peter, we are doing research on that, on climate alliances. A lot of my teaching is about that. It's about simulating things like COP negotiations, trying to describe kind of how can we address climate by taking what we call a future back approach, etc. So all of it being very much about kind of creating a little bit this sense of movement. And I think I'm actually quite optimistic. I think we have moved a long way over the last 5 years, and even more if we take a 10-year perspective. Knowledge has improved, awareness is much higher. There is the backlash, etc. But those are small waves in a big wave. The big wave is that we are, I think, coming on board on the long and not only long term, but the huge challenge of climate and sustainability. So this is an educational challenge, but as educators, I think we have to be leaders as well. We can't just be teachers. We have to, put ourselves out there and be a little bit courageous if we want to have impact. That's it, Rose, as introduction.
So I love this, not only we are educators, but we actually have to look into the future. We can't just teach them what we know and what we've learned, but we also have to look into the future and take a chance and take a risk.
And Rose, let me add one thing, because I mentioned executives, but I said nothing about executives. So at least when I work with executives on sustainability, I also tell them they can't just be executives, they have to be teachers. So they have to put themselves out there and educate as well, because I think in this space, it's really about kind of leading by educating, and educating by taking on a little bit the leadership task as well. So yeah, just to say 2 words about the executives.
Thank you, Knut. And I'm sure Farouk would have something to add about having his students become educators. But let's now turn to Martin.
Thank you very much, Rose. I feel honored to be part of this distinguished panel. I mean, all the participants have overwhelming and wonderful experiences on the direct learning from that. I think Peter, as always, is an extremely modest person. He didn't mention that he was a single champion of the PhD course, and we're the patient kind of servants of his really great ambition. So he should take most of the credit, and we take most of the blame for any mishappenings around that. But it has been a wonderful opportunity. And I think this would be definitely one of my highlights if Peter was not part of this panel. And of course, he already mentioned that, but the fact that Peter managed to put together scholars around the world and, more importantly, actually gather so many students around it, I find it fascinating. And maybe this is the first point I want to make in my short introduction, which is, unlike many things that I have seen as a professor or someone involved in finance, I think for the first time, I think in my career, I've seen something that is kind of launched or practiced at such a global scale. And I think it's important because we need to recognize that the problems that we are dealing with at the moment are truly global. So unless we take the global solution to solving these problems, we are not going to get anywhere. And I don't want to bore people with examples, but as a kind of empirical scholar, I have been trained to focus on very well-identified experiments in the localized space. And one thing that I have learned over the last couple of years from research that I do is that doesn't work, because we are not going to solve this problem if one factory of one little community solves the climate problem. We need to actually implement it at a large scale. And at this point, all these little tricks that we learn in the classroom kind of fail because coordination problems arise, the cost sharing, resource allocations are all the problem. And I think that makes this topic very challenging and very unique. So that's the first kind of observation I have. And the second observation I want to share is this idea that there is a very strong codependence between what we call research, teaching, service, and maybe policy kind of branch. I think as someone who has been teaching in business schools over 20 years, my typical approach to research and teaching was more thinking in terms of parallel streams. There was a share of material I used to teach, and there was a share of material I used to research. And sadly, oftentimes these two would not intersect. And one thing that I found extremely gratifying over the last couple of years, at least in my professional career, is how much I can actually now bring my research that I do on a day-to-day basis into the classroom. And this is not because I don't have things to talk about. It's because these things are so relevant. And I think we need to kind of integrate these things together at all possible layers. And Peter did not mention one more thing that I want to give him an amazing credit for. And Peter, again, this was my appetite to bring to today's panel. Peter has a very nice paper with his student Matteo Gasparini that actually indicates the rise in popularity on sustainability and more specifically climate topics in research. And it's staggering at what speed this research has been produced. So if I could take one graph out of what I've observed at a kind of popular level, what kind of summarizes what we are observing right now, that would be that picture from Peter's actually paper, which I think is amazing. The effort you took to produce it is great. And I think it serves a big purpose because what we learn is that there is a massive inflow and it comes with the cost, Rose and everyone. The cost is that we need to be up to date with everything we do. And I found it extremely challenging, but at the same gratifying that every year I come to a classroom or I come to present or I come to interact with other people, I need to kind of be very hot on my feet in the sense that I need to be ready to answer questions that I would not be asked a year before. This is how fast these things are changing. And I think this is our responsibility to kind of lead rather than lag. And I sometimes have, maybe this is the kind of a little bit of a sour taste, that in this space, sometimes academics are a little bit behind the curve. And I would like us to be the forward thinkers rather than backward thinkers, because by observing what's happening in policy circles, in business circles, I feel that there is a lot of happening. And we academics oftentimes are too much reactionary rather than prescriptive in the way how we should be thinking about it. So let me stop here and thank you again for having me.
So, you know how wonderful it is to hear from an editor of a top-ranked finance journal to talk about we need to produce research that is applied, that is practical, that solves big problems. So speaking of solving climate problems, Lawrence Swinkels is from Erasmus University Rotterdam, but he has been leading climate research, in particular at his current institution, which is one of the largest climate fund in Europe and in the world. So Lawrence, please take the microphone.
Yeah, thanks, Rose. So indeed, my position is 20% or 1 day a week, you could say, at the university, but 80% in industry, in the finance industry, where we tend to think together with our clients, which are biggest institutional investors, about not only about climate, but how to incorporate sustainability more in general, and climate is one part of it, into institutional portfolios. And what the effect of this is both for the investor and for the real world. So I think that's what I try to do every day, and I do therefore research both that I publish in academic journals, but also research that is really applied to investor portfolios and to our own portfolios and those of our clients. And I think so a lot of the research that I do is actually directed to the portfolios. What I think for me to see like the speed of change on sustainability increasing, I think I would encourage people to really think about also what is what has the biggest real world impact. And I think that's really important because in the end, I think many sustainable investors that I talk to want to not only have their portfolios decarbonized or something like that, but want to have the world to change. And that's the goal. And I think what I've seen, so I think the research is not so much only finance, but it connects several disciplines, maybe financial economics, but maybe also political economics and different things, because I think there's many things we can do in finance, but sometimes they're indirect. And often the problems are solved the best by trying to tackle them as directly as possible. And I think to have the problems tackled directly, we should also look into what are the best policies to take that have direct impact on society and make the society a better place. So not hope that people will change, but provide incentives where necessary that it makes sense for people to change. And I think that can really, if we hope for people's behavior to change, this may take 1 or 2 generations before it actually changes. When it makes sense to change, change can come a lot faster. And I think for many of the sustainable issues that we're dealing with, we all benefit if the change is more rapid than if it's slow. And I think finance has a role to play in this, to finance that change, that transition to a more sustainable world. But I think to have all the hopes on finance is a little bit overestimated. I think it should be, how to say, a bigger research project where both politics and economics and finance come together to solve these issues. And because I have a hard time believing that only finance can do the job fast enough for the world to become better.
Thank you, Lawrence. Thank you for that practical industry perspective. Thank you for pointing out the challenges, not just the benefits, but what challenges may lie ahead. And we'll have more discussions on that later. If you just joined the panel, we are now at our final panelist introduction. Farouk Landana, who is a colleague of mine at Rutgers University, championing excellence in business education for decades. So we'll be opening up the floor for Q&A after Farouk's introduction. Please put in your questions as we talk. And if you're putting your questions, please put your name and your institution, your role in your institution, as well as your question. And if there's a specific panelist you would like to raise your question to. Farouk, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Rose. And thanks for having me on this amazing panel. Every single comment from every speaker has me resonating here. But before I even talk about finance and net zero and things like that, I just think that before we do anything, we need to reintroduce the concept of debating and discussion and discourse in our students. They just don't know how to have a discussion. At the executive, my world is the executive MBA space, but you can look at undergraduates, MBAs, PhDs. So, you have it's the tails of the distribution, one strident tail on the left and one strident tail on the right, and their opinions are baked in. There is no discussion, and I think they have lost the ability, or maybe they never had the ability to engage in discourse as we did growing up, So the whole notion of debate and discourse is largely missing. And, there is no fat part of the distribution anymore. That's gone. It's just the tails. And so I think that's step number 1, is to somehow encourage discourse. And the fact that both sides can converge towards the middle, it's not like one group goes to their social media and their outlets of media, and the other group, their outlets, and never the twain shall meet. So that's one comment right off the top, and I'm working on it. The other one is what Marcin and Lawrence and actually all the speakers said. I'm an engineer by training from IIT in India. And so my focus is on implementation. And what I'm about to say, I'm going to say it with some trepidation. But the net zero thing, it's not adding up, guys. It's 3 to 4 trillion a year for 30 years. Okay, so all these young people wandering around with t-shirts saying net zero now. Okay, that's not happening. Now, obviously we want net zero. We have to converge towards a net zero. But as an engineer, I think the focus should be on implementation and practicality. And, as an economist now, For a while there, we could print money like we had gone crazy. You know, in COVID, it was that weird modern monetary theory. It was an aberration in macroeconomics where you could print gazillion pieces of paper and there would be no hyperinflation because we had a liquidity trap. You know, the money just sat there and you print money, and if it sits there, it doesn't give you a hyperinflation. And so that's how we managed to pay for COVID and the vaccines and the respirators and all that sort of thing. But now we can't do that anymore. That story is over. Now that money is inflationary. Inflation is back. So that weird world where we could print money and fund whatever we wanted to fund, the subprime crisis earlier on, COVID during the COVID years, that story is over. And so if I could talk to the leaders of the planet and say, hey, you're going to have to cut back the spending because inflation is back. And now when you spend money, it's going to show up as inflation. And so once again, deficits matter. Once again, fiscal reticence is important. And so the whole spending on the net zero, it's all in jeopardy now. You know, you go back to the drawing board. And so what I have been pushing in the executive MBA program is Adam Smith. I've gone back to the fundamental roots of economics. How do we behave in the way we are supposed to behave without being policed? You know, and that's what Adam Smith taught us, to how do you adopt an incentive structure, and only after you adopt and invent a perfect incentive structure do you step back and let the invisible hand work. And so that's where I'm taking my classes to try, and because remember, I've been teaching in China since 1991. And I miss the old China, frankly. The new China, Xi Jinping has mucked it up, sadly. But the Chinese have a lovely expression which says, if you try and build a 50-foot wall to regulate behavior, somebody will invent a 51-foot ladder. And so policing regulations don't work. You know, we have pledges for net zero, 98% of the planet is covered. But those pledges, I'm not sure how much they mean. And the offsets and the metrics, we all know the story. And so I'm going back to Adam Smith in class, and it's very hard to design a policy that runs on itself in the society's own interest without having a policing authority, because I think that's the only way we can make this happen. And again, I say this with a lot of trepidation. I fully expect Rose to mute my microphone any second.
If only I had that power. No, thank you, thank you, Farooq. This is what we are here for. We want a frank and honest discussion. We want to know what's the best way forward. We want to come up with strategies. And you mentioned Adam Smith. Adam Smith, I think Oxford was the home of Adam Smith. So I'm going to ask Peter perhaps to unmute himself. And since Peter was the dean for many years there.
Sure. So
his thoughts. Yeah.
My internet is unstable. So if it is, somebody wave at me, please. Adam Smith wrote two great books, The Wealth of Nations in 1776 and Theory of Moral Sentiment in 1759. I think you have to take those two books together. And Invisible Hand is a relatively small part of The Wealth of Nations. So sorry, you've just wandered into real Oxford territory here. But Farooq, I agree with you that the amount of money that we need to raise in order to address the climate crisis is huge. There's no question about that. It's about the same size on an ongoing basis as we spent on COVID. It's about the same size, by the way, as the amount of fossil fuel subsidies we currently offer. So, right now I think fossil fuel subsidies are $7 trillion a year globally. And that's about what you would need to think about that. And I'll go beyond COAS. I'll go beyond Adam Smith to talk about COAS, and then I'm going to cold call Marcin, if I might. So, we all like Pigouvian taxes, but, Marcin's colleague Patrick has written this outstanding paper called The Great Carbon Arbitrage, which suggests that there's other ways to solve these problems. So, for example, under their calculations, it would cost $29 trillion to shut down the coal industry, which is a massive number. But even at a cost of carbon, a social cost of carbon at, I think, $90 a ton, that's somewhere slightly less than $100 trillion of benefits. So yes, there's massive amounts of money involved. I just ran a session last week on climate finance at Harvard, but then the ROI on those investments is huge. We just have to figure out a way to capture that some of the R to justify the I. So yeah, it's through these problems.
Thank you.
And some of that may be regulation, and some of it may be taxes, and some of it may be in of quotient bribes. So if you got any of that, passing over to whomever.
So, the tax cuts help. The Inflation Reduction Act actually isn't bad, in terms of appropriate tax benefits for behaving well. So as that package is concerned, there is a lot of good in that along these lines. And so that fills me with hope too.
Marcin?
Yeah, I wanted to make one point, which I actually sometimes find difficult to solve. So to some extent, I think part of the solutions that we are thinking about in getting where we need to get are making strong assumptions. We are kind of assuming that we have all sorts of technologies and all that is needed is money. And I understand that financial resources are extremely important, but I think sometimes I like to pause and say, what is this money supposed to finance? And I just give you one very simple example from research I've done with Patrick and a student of ours who is actually going to Rotterdam now, Maurice Wiedemann. So we actually look at a very simple question. Like, we have all these policies which are supposed to subsidize innovation in green technologies. And all these policies are under a very simple argument. All we need is money. Send money to all these creators and problem solved. And we look at the data globally and try to see how much actually innovation predicts future emissions. And sadly, we found nothing. We basically found that there is absolutely no link from innovation to subsequent decarbonization at the global level. And when I mean innovation here, I mean patenting. So it may be that these technologies already exist and the early kind of innovators are not adding up, but money is going there. So what I wanted to maybe qualify what Farokh has said partly is that I think money is important, but I think what we also need is a little bit of a targeted policy, because too much money is going without any kind of accountability in a way that we need to know what is this, that this money is doing. We learned it from the ESG funds. I'm sure Lawrence would be able to comment on this more than I can, that it's very easy to put a label on yourself to fool people and attract money. But exposed, we learned that this was a very bad idea. In fact, I consider this one of the worst fallacies of the last 5 years, because it somehow put people in a doubt mode, especially those who are on the fence, whether they believe in the action or not, in a sense that they now think of it as some kind of snake oil that they were getting into. And I think unless we get very specific and very precise in a way what this money is supposed to do, and we provide convincing evidence that this money is actually doing what it's supposed to do, there will be a lot of back and forth and a lot of inertia, not because people are necessarily bad evil, but I think none of us wants to think that we are kind of funding enterprise that is going nowhere just to stuff someone's pockets, etc. So I think we need to be a little bit more nuanced. That's kind of how I see the next few steps. And I would be optimistic about the objectives. I don't think we should cave in at all. I just think we need to be much more disciplined, much more careful in the directions that we take going forward.
Thank you, Marcin. I see Knut unmuted a few times, trying to.
Because all the introductions, but also now the discussion, it just triggers so many thoughts, and I'm fully on board. So I just wanted to share, since we have this discussion, where are we and what's the real message, etc. I wanted to share. I promise it's just one slide, but it's maybe something I prepared as a little bit of my perspective on where we are. Okay, so I'll just put it on and spend 30 seconds explaining, not more. So I think, Marcin, I think you are right. we're moving into a new phase of sustainability. And I think it's a good thing. I think it's a necessary thing in so many ways. So first of all, I made it in very simple, of course. But the first thing is, I think we're over the awareness. I think we're now judged on what we do. So talking about it, okay, it's fine, but it's really about what we do. Secondly, reporting is too complicated in many ways, but it's also necessary, etc. Materiality is the essence from my perspective. That's where we define what's really important. And then third point I wanted to make, I think the time of dolphins is over. The kind of jumping around and making big announcements and bragging about what you're going to do, etc. Whales, they stay underwater, they do their stuff, and they only come up when needed. And last one, and that's what made me put this on, Marcin, is I think we're in the show me the money phase. I don't think this kind of the hype is over. And that's not just a bad thing. It's in many ways a necessary and in many ways also a good thing. Companies are gonna ask us to help them do the things that will make them grow, be more profitable, do the right things. It's over a little bit this throwing just money at things because the intention is good. And this to me is the new era of sustainability. And I think evolution-wise, we're passing a threshold. We're passing the awareness threshold. We're entering into the action threshold. It's going to be more difficult, but it is necessary. That's my perspective. And the last point I make is a little bit more global point. It's under there. In a strange kind of way, I think we're getting more global alignment now. And it's not just positive, but it is like, it's the reality we're in my perspective. EU efforts will slow down. IFRS is taking off, it's taking a hold. And China is in many ways stepping up. And that creates a little bit more of a kind of, maybe it's less ambitious than EU was a year ago or 3 years ago, etc. But it makes this more global. And at the end of the day, I think this has to be global, because that's, I think, from my perspective, the only way we will, make lasting impact. So Marcin, you triggered me. It's your fault that I'm showing the slide, but I especially this show me the money. I think the phase of just making promises, doing things even if it's not profitable, etc. I think it's over, honestly, and I think that's maybe a good thing. All, Ross. It's just I was inspired by the discussion.
No, Knut, that was wonderful. Thank you. We haven't yet heard from Lawrence, who actually writes many papers about this topic.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that was also mentioned, that maybe now people are a little bit more concerned also about what is called greenwashing. So just putting money into something that is labeled green and then feel good that you do something. Exactly. That more and more people are really looking at what do we achieve with this money? What are we investing in and what will it achieve for the world? So I think that has been a big change that I've seen over the past years. So one of the big shifts, for example, in corporate bonds investing has been the issuance of green bonds that have seen a massive growth, and the kind of many pros and cons of all these developments. But I think one of the big positives that comes out of this is that many companies commit themselves to do greener projects, to green their revenues, and it's a way for investors to finance the transition from brown polluting climate to more green climate. Of course, there's, like I said, we can come up with disadvantages or incentive problems, but in the greater thing, I think this is some development that has been very positive. Of course, with the risk of greenwashing your portfolio, but if you really look at what some of the more serious companies have been doing on issuing green bonds, I think that has been a huge step forward on committing to becoming greener. And I think that's also necessary, because I think the time that you can just pretend to be good is that's over. I think another step that I see a lot is that, for example, if you think about investing in or financing government bonds, that the ESG, Martin already brought it up, that's what has been done a lot, is looking at metrics that are kind of backward looking on where are countries when on their progress to the SDGs, for example. Well, guess what? Which countries have a lot of progress on SDGs? That's the developed world. Norway, Netherlands, Denmark, etc. They have made a lot of progress, but is that really where the capital is needed to make progress on the SDGs? So what we have been developing at together with a colleague from Robeco is a framework that is like the government SDG framework, where we don't focus on what is already there, but where the right policies are in place, where the money is needed, so that investors can build a portfolio that finances those governments that have policies in place to actually make the largest improvements on SDGs. But it sounds maybe obvious when I say, but that's something that is, if you look at current metrics of a portfolio, it doesn't always look good, because the current SDG progress metrics are not so good. But I think many investors are not that much interested in whether I think in the old days maybe, or like previously, investors would look at how do the metrics line up against peers or competitors or whatever. But more and more, the shift is to how do I contribute to the transition to a better world on climate, or on SDGs more broadly. And I think that's where the challenge is, and also for me the hope that the world will change for a better place, that more investors are looking to that side, where their dollar invested has the highest marginal improvement on sustainability.
That's a wonderful perspective, Lawrence, because the typical view is the emerging markets, and I, being an editor for Emerging Markets Journal, you know, that gets a lot of papers that talk about this issue, that emerging markets, Africa, you know, the global South, they are in a very early stage of development, and for them, it's a luxury to talk about climate change. They'd rather talk about where next dinner comes from and how to develop their economy better. And so, you know, our session is titled Profitable Sustainability. Can it be sustainable? Can it be profitable for these companies in emerging markets? Perhaps this is something both you and Knut can weigh in, since Knut has some wonderful case examples that he's written about on companies from emerging markets. You know, how do we balance those two views? You mentioned that what you've been doing at Robeco. Did you see there are shifts that funds go to emerging markets because they are trying to do something?
Yeah, so what we see is that not specific. I think there's many considerations why you should or should not invest in certain emerging markets. So it's not, but one of the it's not that I see that investors are avoiding emerging markets because of the, let's say, sustainability problems or so. I think more and more I see that actually the opposite is true, that that's where the most progress can be made. And if only the developed markets world will change, that's only a small part of, like, and the air is it's traveling all over the world, so that's not something that you can limit to a certain jurisdiction. So cooperation here is key, and I think more and more investors are looking at what is called transition finance. So how can we finance transition to a better world? And emerging markets play a big role in that, maybe even a bigger role than companies in developed markets.
Farouk, go ahead, and then we'll hear from Knut.
So, you know, it might actually be that this could be very local, could be all very idiosyncratic. And let me give you a little example. Rwanda, there were mountain gorillas that were being gunned down and poached. And there were huge fines, but the villagers were being bribed. And so it made sense for them to point out where the mountain gorillas were, and the poachers would then gun them down. And the bribes would be $25,000 and so on. So the gorillas were being extinct, they were about to go. And so they came up with this plan, going back to, do I dare say it, Adam Smith, where they said, let's try and do ecotourism. Let's try and invite small groups of people to watch these mountain gorillas from a distance. So it was the Smithsonian magazine and the National Geographic. So they led tours of 15, 20 eco-tourists who would watch these gorillas from a distance and pay huge amounts of money to watch them for just a few hours, so the tour guide would be like, there's the mother there with her baby, shh, and okay, that's it, let's move away now, that sort of thing. And lo and behold, all that money they generated went to the villagers. So now the villagers decided, okay, this is a much better deal. There is no point getting bribed by the poachers. And let me fast forward, the mountain gorilla in Rwanda is off the endangered species. There are too many of them now. And now any kind of poacher shows up from the West, they alert everybody, they drive the guy away. They want these animals alive. And so this is now a system that is automatic. It doesn't have to be policed. There is no global agency watching over them. There are no green bonds washing over anything. This is all idiosyncratic, local, sustainable. It makes sense for it to happen. And now you have the invisible hand. You step away and you let this baby run. Indulge me with another example from my son. My son is head of disease propagation in studies in Minnesota. And he was in Iowa earlier. And he was telling me, he said, Farouk, the big farmers in Iowa are polluting the groundwater. We're going to nail them. We're going to throw them in jail. We're going to bust them. And I said, Christopher, it's not going to work. And he said, so what do I do? And I said, here's what you do. You have a tax surcharge, because what was happening is the pig farmers were dumping all the refuse in the groundwater. And these are huge pig farms in Iowa. And so I said, have a tax surcharge, 25%. And that tax surcharge gets waived if the groundwater is clean. And so he said, well, Farouk, the inspector comes, they'll just bribe the inspector. I said, no, a drone flies overhead. And in my executive MBA class, interestingly, one of the students' husbands was designing those drones. And so the drone flies overhead, middle of the night, zaps the water, makes sure it's clean, and the farmer gets an email saying, you got your tax credit. And the conversation at the farm is the farmer is telling his workers, hey, don't you dare toss that junk in the groundwater. Put it on the truck and drive it 25 miles to the recycling plant, man, because I don't want to pay taxes on this. And so now we have that problem solved. No policeman, running by itself in their natural interest. And so I'm thinking, rather than massive aggregated agencies, this is going to be a local story and painstakingly designed. Adam Smith is not easy. Designing the right policy is very hard.
Great examples of Adam Smith, Farouk.
Yes, and so that's the point I wanted to make. It's going to be a local effort, very painfully and carefully designed, where the metrics are fuzzy, but the system runs on its own.
I can see why your course gets sold out at Rutgers EMBA program. Very persuasive as well. But let's hear what Knut was preparing to say.
Yeah, but I love listening to you, Farouk, because I like it when we tell real stories. So I think the gorillas got me thinking there. It's of course very difficult to kind of talk only kind of developed, etc. There's so much nuance there. But I would say one thing, which is often when we talk about kind of sustainability in developing countries, sustainability in developed countries, I think we in developed countries, we talk very much about the E, whereas the S is in many ways more important in developing countries for natural reasons. So that's to me a very big difference. And then secondly, I think and this we did this, but it's now some years ago when I was with the WEF, we did this study, 1,000 sustainability champions from emerging markets. So we looked at 1,000 companies, identified 16, etc. One thing we found is there is huge innovation in sustainability, lots of champions, lots of incredible role model type companies. But the innovation on average, and you can't say about every company, but it's more often driven by scarcity than just investments. It's driven by real needs, and you have to fix it, etc. So it's, in some ways the pattern was a little bit different. But then last point maybe is I think and Lawrence, you said that some of the most impressive innovations come from emerging countries, right? For example, microfinance. I mean, that's a huge sustainability innovation in my book, and I think it comes from exactly this. It's a social focused innovation. It's driven by scarcity, but it has tremendous impact, and it's kind of that kind of innovation which is needed, and I think it's maybe like you said as well, Farouk, it's localized in a way. I mean, of course, microfinance is broader, but at its foundation, it's very localized. It's very connected, I would say. So I don't want to be too broad stroke on the difference, because there are so many nuances and so many differences as well. But I think often if we sit here in developed markets, we look at this through the lens of E, but what we see is very much the S of the social side, and that's incredibly important as well, I think,
Can I say one thing? Oh, sorry, Peter, you want to go first? Go, please. So I just think kind of connecting back, I think it's wonderful to talk about the practice, but at the same time, I think I still want to steer a little bit towards education, because it's to some extent our mission in many ways. And I think what we are missing, at least as I feel it, and I also feel it sometimes in research, to be honest with you, when I do my own research, but also reading other people's research, what we really need are clearly specified objective functions. What I find the discussion to be very much missing is naming things in a precise way. We got used to words green, sustainable. These are all good words, but they are very loaded words. And oftentimes the tools that you use to actually optimize within these words are very different. And we already know that when you even think about the UN principles, they are oftentimes contradictory to each other in the way how you can meet them. So it's not like there is this global Pareto improvement that we can actually achieve. I think, to me, what we should instill in our students and also in our research and the communications that we have with policymakers is that, look, how much did we deliver on what we kind of set to deliver? What was the kind of objective function that we set for ourselves? And what is that we have actually achieved out of this? Take an example of decarbonization. Farouk has mentioned biodiversity. All these things oftentimes are a little bit different objects, yet we put them into one sack. And I mean, when I see it, especially in research, I find that we are missing on our goal, because plenty full of data these days, so many different metrics. But I think what I really have a little bit aversion against is naming them the same thing. I really think they are not one and the same thing. And I think we need this discipline and responsibility. And I think that's going to be better, because then we can start identifying what works in a much more precise way, rather than just throwing random things in random places. And I think that would be very helpful. Sorry, Peter, I'm sure you will have wiser things to say, so apologies.
No, I think, Martin, you're absolutely correct. But, to kind of connect some of these streams, I agree that activity has to be local, but the incentives often have to be global in nature. Take, for example, CBAM, which I think we're just starting to understand. CBAM, if, in a theoretical way, would encourage everybody who's a trading partner of somebody of a country which has a CBAM regime to try to capture the tax revenues locally, as opposed to hand them over to somebody in Europe. So now to Martin's point, as academics, what can we do to help think about the design of CBAM systems? How can we model them? Can we do empirical work after the fact? Can we do agent-based modeling before the fact? Can we do various kinds of things that don't normally find their way into journals that would help inform how that set of policies would work? The other thing, just to acknowledge it, is that there are kind of vested interests in society and much more so vested interests in business that are not, especially in a world without kind of carbon taxes, that are quite happy in the system that we have right now. So in the course that we teach, one of the papers that I taught was a paper by actually, I can't remember who wrote it, but it's about lobbying activities. The author will come back to me. And, the return of anti-climate lobbying is positive, according to that paper. There are people who make money from kind of slowing down progress against climate. And, we take for granted that everybody is of the same nature, or maybe can be either compensated or incented in the same way, but it's certainly not the case. So there is something about, we're all at business schools, we all believe in the power of business, but, not all businesses have the same values. And therefore, we can't expect them to, for example, kind of as an impact investor might, moderate the return expectations. We might have to be bribing them, as I was saying before, and we might not expect that they're going to play by the rules of the game, in which case we might need much more draconian rules in order to stop certain behaviors. We saw over the last 20 years, the fossil fuel industry aggressively, hiding information. My colleague at Harvard, Naomi Orestes, has written about that, but many others have well. So there's something about the reality of business that is both exciting in terms of innovation, even though I think I'm not going to disagree with Marchin's analysis that maybe the money we're throwing at isn't producing the results, but also much more insidious, especially when it is related to a political system, which is symbiotic to it. So I don't know that. I don't mean to go to the dark place, but we have to acknowledge that as part of our teaching, our research, who we celebrate, and more.
So Peter, since you're the last one who spoke on this topic, you're unique in this panel in the sense that not only you do research, active research, but also you're an excellent teacher. Your course have won awards many times, and recently the MBA course you designed at Oxford won the Aspen Institute's Pioneer Award, which is very prestigious award. But this is while you were the dean at Oxford Said's Business School, and you had so many initiatives there. I can't possibly list all of them, but to name a few, you increased Africans in terms of students enrolling in the program have gone from a mere 2% to something like almost 20 female students. So you were a big champion for diversity, and this is why we're doing research and teaching. So so what, for those of audience and people who are going to view our videos later who may not have a chance to ask this question, what was your strategy as the dean, to do everything, to implement all these big changes, to do your research, to teach well? I want to say that it cannot be as simple as learning to drink tea, as you joked in the Poets and Quants.
So first of all, I'm not sure that I was an outstanding dean nor even a model of deans. But what I did do and tried to do was to have a fairly clear and consistent view about what an elite university, and that word is a dangerous word to use, but I'm going to use it, because if Oxford and Harvard and places like where we are not elite, then who are? So if a well-resourced, high, kind of brand institution doesn't take a leading role, then who's going to do that? So that's where I started, and it was pretty simple after that. As well as thinking about, I think, Knut, you used was it future forward? There was an expression you used, I wrote down.
Future back.
Future back.
Yeah.
So future back. So let's just do that exercise together. Where do we want the business world to be in 25 years? And therefore, what does a business school today have to look like in order to get us there? Who has to be the students? What do they have to know? What set of skills, but also what set of values do they need? And, you know, how do we kind of not just arm them with a set of technical skills, but also sometimes it's called critical thinking. So let me just be precise about it. You know, at the beginning of business school history, or close to the beginning of business school history, at Harvard Business School, roughly around it was founded in 1908, but around by 1920 or so, the dean there had an expression to describe what business schools were all about and what business was all about. And it was about earning decent profits decently. And that was in fact the mantra of Harvard Business School for the first maybe 40 or 50 years. My colleague at Oxford talked about profitable solutions to problems of people and planet, which I think is an elegant way to say, you know, in 2024, what Dean Donham said in 2020. And I think that as much as we need to teach about carbon taxes, and we need to teach about CBAM, and we need to teach about, you know, science-based targets and all that, you know, I wouldn't say at the end of the day, but at the beginning of each day, we have to also set a guidepost for where we're headed. And that's all I tried to do. And, you know, if you kind of future back, you know, of course it made sense to go and move from 22 to 48% of women. And of course it made sense to move from 2 to 13% Africans. And of course it made sense that all of our students learned about sustainability. It's hard to imagine a future where that wouldn't be the case. So I don't know that I did anything well, and I think my colleagues would say I was probably a bit heavy-handed in the whole thing, but it simply came from that exercise, to look at the forward and move backward, as opposed to look at the current and say, oh, what's going to make everybody happy today? And because we know that what's going to make everybody happy today are the things that will maybe not be long-lasting in terms of not just happiness, but kind of a planet that is livable, a society that's inhabitable. So it's, you know, for me, it wasn't all that complicated. What was complicated was implementing, but it wasn't complicated to think about what that future might look like.
Thank you, Peter. Knut, I love that concept of future back. Do you? I see that you just unmuted yourself. So, were you going to add something to what Peter said?
Yeah, I'm happy to. I'm just reading the comment from Thomas here, which I will definitely come back to in a second. No, I think you're right, Peter, that you know, many things are complicated if we take a short-term perspective. And the problem with the short-term perspective is we tend to just keep doing what we're doing today. So it's a little bit of a kind of we can't call it a success trap, because we're not succeeding that well in many ways today. But if we take a long-term perspective, many things become much clearer, right? It becomes much clearer what's really important, what's the direction we have to go, etc. And I think, personally, I think Future Back is a good way to frame one good way. There are many, but one good way to frame sustainability, climate challenges, etc. And then I wanted to, and now a lot of focus on you, Oxford, etc., Peter. But I was there with you some years ago, and when after having been there, and we did this Oxford Union debate, you know, and I built 2 cases on, and I call them Friedman meets Freeman. So Friedman, we all know. Freeman is Ed Freeman, so it's the stakeholder theory. So I have this small case. I'm happy to share it with everybody who's interested. We prepare it, we prepare in groups, we find speakers, and then we do the Oxford Union debate where the stakeholder perspective meets the shareholder perspective. And then you have the discussion, you do the questions, you do it just like an Oxford Union debate, and afterwards you just share reflections. And I think that goes back to you, Farouk. We need real discussions. And often the teacher can't add much, but giving the kind of space for reflection, I think, is so important. And one of the reasons it's more important now is that it's more complicated right now. We probably need a bit of the stakeholder and we need a bit of the shareholder, and that has to be navigated. And most important, it has to be reflected on. And I think business schools, we have not only have a responsibility, sure, we have a responsibility, not only do we have to change, but this is a mega big opportunity for us as well. We can do so many exciting things. We can engage business students, future leaders, etc., in so many new ways on something so important. You know, that's a bit the way I think about it.
So, Knut, you run probably the most well-known sustainability executive MBA program.
I don't know if it is, but at least we try to put it in the center. And what the thing we did at IMD, which I liked, was we invited the World Business Council for Sustainable Development to join us for a year and just be our friend and challenger. So they were there and they kind of told us, you're not doing this, it's not relevant, change this too much. So they were kind of helping us for a year. And I think for us, we wouldn't be able to do the same without, you know, we needed that outside in challenging, I think. But now we at least we learned something, and yeah, now it's right there in the middle, I would say.
Yeah, and this has been a few years old. It's not just you know,
yeah, it may be 4 or 5 years now that we've done it. Maybe we've started 7, 8 years ago, and then yeah, now it feels like it's. But now there's more to do. So there's no.
I was just going to ask you,
what so much more to do, right?
What's the next step? Do you envision the program?
You know, if I was gonna build a new university program or business school program, I would invite you, Peter, because we've not only discussed this, but not only did the initiative on business schools, but we've also done research on, I call it system leadership. But I think we have to educate leadership beyond just leading our companies. We have to teach future leaders how to lead in bigger systems, in collaborations, shaping the agenda, even if they don't have all the, you know, authority, power, resources, etc. And for me, that's like Harvard 80 years ago, Peter. That's the next thing. That to me is the next phase of business education. Not the only one, but one very important one, I think.
I'm going to come back to Farouk, because Farouk also, I would say that you are a disruptor in business education. You know, you practically founded the EMBA program, and it's been one of the top ranked EMBA program, you know, from Rutgers University. That's very unusual. So Farouk, I think one of the things that you are well known for is agile curriculum. How do you keep it agile?
Interesting you mentioned that. So I was conducting an open house a few months ago, and somebody in class said, okay, so you adopted an agile approach. And I said, listen, I was agile before the word was invented, you know, so long ago. And I said, I had no choice. One more time, I have NYU, Columbia, Cornell to the north of me. I have Wharton to the south of me, and all you guys all around me. I had no choice. So just matching those schools was an exercise in futility. I had to outperform them. I had to hit harder and faster. But anyway, going back to what Peter just said, I would also like to add history. I'd like to go way back. And there is absolutely no sense of history, of any kind of historical knowledge in our students, in our executives, in our leaders. All our leaders on this planet right now, and I'm actually not exaggerating, all are overstated, loud, vacuous. Where is the leadership? And so I've actually taken my class to Gettysburg battlefield 3 or 4 times. There's a lot of military history. There's a tons of history in the program at all levels. In my macroeconomics course, in the leadership course, and I'm thinking that has to be revisited, reintroduced in curricula across the board, because it really is important that, you know, just the US-China story, you know, very few people understand that the reason China is so paranoid goes back to the Opium Wars. The Opium Wars are so important in understanding why China behaves in the way it does. It was a national embarrassment, without going into the details. And so I actually used to take them to the old summer palace when I took my class to China. Because without understanding the opium wars, you can't even understand the Hong Kong story. You can't understand China's paranoia for the rest of the world. And so just a little example there. Just the Ukraine-Russia thing, little do they, even the modern generations don't understand how closely they fought the Germans side by side. And so history, I would add history to Peter's list of items to be included in our curricula, because it's imperative that they understand it.
I think Lawrence had written something about understanding finance history.
Yeah, that's true. But I think for what I would like to contribute now to the discussion, what I think is a skill that I see less and less, and that connects to what Farouk said in the beginning of the talk, is that it's okay to change your mind. I think in sustainability, we learn a lot, at least I learn a lot every day. And of course, I have my priors on certain problems, how they can be solved or how it will work in reality. But I think now I see more and more people that are dug in to their belief or to their method of solving things. And like, if I think about it as a Bayesian, like you get new data about what has been tried, what has been worked, and it is okay. And actually, I think it's not just okay. I think it should be encouraged for people that get new information to change their mind. Because now it was sometimes seen as a weakness to change your mind about something because you're not consistent, you don't have the same, I don't know, there's a lot of, you have to stick with what you originally thought. That's what is correct, otherwise you're weak. And I think actually it's a strength to have a belief. You see data, reality, or new things coming at you, and you're open enough to change your mind. Maybe it's not as I thought in the beginning. And I think that's something that I'm not so sure that maybe I'm also not teaching that sufficiently to my class of finance students, that it's okay to change, and not just okay, it's a virtue that you can change your mind if you get new insights into a topic. And I'm not sure how good I can do it myself, but that's what I try to do when I get new information myself about studies that I do myself, but also that others are doing and that I'm reading from SSRN or from here on seminars. It's okay to change my mind. It's very good if I can. I learned something new. That's what I tried to add to the discussion that was said. I think that's very important skill.
And I think you just triggered everybody to unmute. So I don't know who should be starting, but I think Martin had his hand up. So
I just wanted to make one connection to the history, maybe in a little bit of a perverse way. I fully agree with everything that was said, that history is very important and we should learn from past. But I just want to caution one opposite thinking, which I hear sometimes from top economists, and that's the notion that we are kind of going in cycles. And this is yet another kind of downturn that is going to be followed by the upturn, the same way how we have gone through COVID, we have recovered. And this notion that everything is stationary, that we always go around some kind of long-term, okay, and in the end, everything is going to be okay. It's very dangerous because it leads to inertia and it leads to actions that may not be reversed. And again, I'm not a prophet and I don't want to sound like a prophet, but one thing that I kind of learned from all the science and everything I'm trying to read on a daily basis is that these things are far from being stationary and things can go out of control in a way that it may be difficult for us to bring it back to the normal trajectory. So when I hear economists say this is just a couple of % of GDP, even if that number is correct, that's not the point. The point is that it may no longer be the planet that is actually about GDP anymore, or it may be that the paradigm has shifted so much that these principles that we are so dogmatically defending because they've worked over the past and the history has told us that in the end we always land on 4 feet may actually not repeat. And again, I don't know the answer, maybe I'm wrong, but I always give this analogy to people. Even if I'm right with 5% probability or even less than that, would people decline insurance if they learn that their house is going to burn with probability 5 or 10%? I doubt it. And for some reason, people don't understand this game of probabilities very easily. When someone tells us your probability of something bad happening changes from 2% to 4%, the answer typically is, I haven't seen my house to burn. So what are you talking about? So it's clearly people think in a very kind of dichotomized way. Either it's 0 or 1, and otherwise it's not true. And I think this is what I think we need to teach our students, and we ourselves need to repeat ourselves, that probabilities and certainty is actually a very powerful force. And we need to kind of understand what are consequences, even if it's not a certain world, that we need to be kind of ready that at some point things may actually become very different than what we are used to. So that's, I mean, maybe a little bit of a gloomy picture, and I'm generally an optimist that we will find a solution. But again, I think that just relying on past and thinking this has always worked out somehow, it's not a solution I would have proposed to anyone in the future.
As usual, Marcin said it so well.
Yeah.
Another way to say it is that the laws of economics are far less strong than the laws of science. So we can create whatever laws we'd like, but and whatever economic principles we like. And we know that economics, if you study the history of economics, is not a linear thing. There have been many, many theories of economics over the last couple of centuries. And so we have to do that. But I wanted to jump in just with empirical evidence on the kind of importance of being able to change somebody's mind. I tried an experiment 2 weeks ago. I was asked if I would put together a session for about 300 Harvard alumni around a controversial topic, which is whether universities should adopt policies of institutional neutrality, whether institutions should have a point of view about things. And needless to say, this was a complicated thing to do. So I decided that the best way to do it was a debate format, in very much fruit what you were talking about, but slightly different format. So I found 4 outstanding individuals. I assigned them to teams and I flipped a coin to determine who would take which side of the argument. So I had the former head of Newsweek and the Washington bureau chief of CNN. I had a reproductive rights constitutional lawyer. This was a good group, but this was not their question. So they had to assume roles that were not theirs. The debate took 48 minutes. At the beginning of the debate, we voted about what these 300 alumni thought was the right course of action. And it was 75-25, with 75% believing the institution should have a policy of institutional neutrality. After 48 minutes of vigorous debate, that switched to 50-50. Now, that's a pretty opinionated group. It's a well-educated group. It's a self-assured group. But yet, even with an extraordinarily, with extraordinarily able debate, fact-based debate, not screaming, not yelling, but a lot of good argument and good evidence, 25% of the people switch their vote. And that to me shows the power of what we can do when we want to do it. So I think it's not only about debating, but it's also about assigning people points of view that are not their own, because that forces them to come into a conversation and to acknowledge that, at least in the way that a lawyer does when they're an advocate for a client, you have to just argue your position and do it the best way you can. And we don't do that enough. I try to do that wherever I can in class, but I grew up as a debater, and it was a remarkably important skill to be able to switch from one side to the other immediately, because when you walked into the room, you might find yourself on one or the other side of the debate topic. So to me, the idea that you could change all those minds was a good reminder about why we do what we do.
Peter, I want to jump in. I think you actually answered the question I was going to ask, because I wanted to ask a question following up on Marcin. I wanted to ask, what is the way in which we can convince people to change before we have to? Because in a way, that's what you're saying, right, Marcin? You're saying the day we have to, it's going to be extremely costly. Even some things are reversible and get out of control, etc. But I think you're illustrating exactly that, Peter. We have to have those discussions where we assign points of view, where we really take the debate the whole way through, etc. Because there are so many discussions I've been part of where people end up saying, okay, we'll deal with the crisis when it happens. But dealing with this crisis when it happens is a really bad strategy, because we don't know how big that crisis is, and we don't know at all how to deal with it and what the consequences are. And I think it's like it's a social science actually for us to have the discussions and come to the conclusion. So thanks, Peter. I think there's something there which is really important. It's not just teaching to the converted. It's actually discussing broadly, even assigning positions and discussing the real issues openly, and with those who are seeing it differently, you know?
So there's so much to talk about, but
Yeah.
we unfortunately are just about to run out of time. We've got about 5 minutes left. So for the panelists, what is one thing, a short sentence, a short summary, one thing you would like our audience, our viewers to take away from today's panel? And for those of you who are in the audience who have been commenting, and thank you, Peter, and thank you, Knut, for answering some of those comments. Farouk, I think there's one specifically for you that I will later on share with you. Those of you in the audience, please give a quick shout out to the panelists. You know, tell them how their thoughts in today's panel have changed. I know it has changed me. Changed, you know, your action plans. So how about let's start with the panelists giving us a takeaway message. And then I will have a look at what people have been saying in the chat. Peter, would you like to go ahead?
Honestly, not really, but I will. So I once had a boss of mine who asked a really interesting question. So, and what it was, you know, like, why do we start by immediately trying to figure out what we can't do as opposed to what we can do? What can we do in classrooms? What can we do in teaching? What can we do in changing people's minds? What can we do in decarbonization? I think we are so incredibly good at being critical analysts that we stop, in some sense, to ask that simpler question about what can we do as opposed to what will work. So it sounds hopelessly naive. Those of you who know me know that I am a naive optimist about many things, but sometimes that's what you need to move things forward.
Thank you, Peter. We'll go with the same. Knut, would you like to go next?
Yeah, I'll go very quick. Yeah, I just want to say thank you to Thomas and Petra, because I've taken note of all your inputs. And Thomas, I'm gonna go into this your source there. So and Petra as well. Petra, you're asking a question. Are we optimistic, right? Every second day I'm pessimistic. Every second day I'm optimistic on this one, on the climate, etc. But the only thing I can say about it is, even when I'm pessimistic, I end up thinking I have to do what I can do. I don't want to point to everybody else and say, okay, the UN doesn't work. No, I'll just have to try to do what I can do, and that's it. But we can do a lot. Maybe that's the last point. I think education has a big role to play here. Partly it's educating in the traditional sense, but partly it's engaging and learning from the younger as well, because they are a mega force on this one, and we better listen to them, because they have something to say, I feel, you know. So that's mine.
Thank you, Knut. Martin?
I mean, yeah, lots of wise statements were made today, so it's hard to really say. But one thing I think I learned over time, and this talk today probably reinforced it even more, is this notion that there is no fairy tale. There is no one good solution that is gonna solve everything. And without putting fingers on, to some extent, I found the idea of carbon tax to create quite a lot of inertia, not because it was a bad idea, but I think it kind of liberated others from taking action, thinking that we already have a solution. And I think what I've learned, and I'm sure my co-speakers would agree with that, is that the way to go is what I call a patchwork approach. I think we need to kind of deal with this on a multiple level of dimensions. and basically observing whether our actions are making a change and adjust on the fly. But I think hoping for some kind of super fancy first best solutions, fairy tales, is just a myth. I just don't think it exists. And as much as optimism I would like to hold, I think in the end it will come down to some kind of daily grind that we all will have to go on our own terms, with our own approaches that work. Maybe the Rwanda case, maybe another kind of case, rather than just thinking that we can solve it all once with our COVID vaccine, as we got really lucky to solve. Let's just be very frank about that.
Lawrence, please go ahead.
Yeah, so it's difficult to add all these things. I'm just thinking because I think that like Martin said, that it's very difficult to think about. I mean, finance will solve it or something like that. So I think there has been, both from the engineering side, from the innovation side. We are not innovating; we are financing innovation, but innovation that will really help this. And maybe as a point that was also mentioned, that we should not forget about the social aspect of things. So we can think about what is, I don't know, economically, well, financially, maybe like optimal. But if there's too many people that are left behind, so that for them it's not socially achievable or desirable to get to some solutions, it will be problematic, because we all have to solve it together. And the social aspect of change is also very important, to keep everybody on board and support the policies that are, or the policies that are invented. And I think that's something that we shouldn't forget about, the social dimension of the change, of the transition.
Thank you, Lawrence. Baruch.
So thanks, Rose. So I'm from the 60s, you know, and there was a band back then, and I'm sure some of you know them, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. And they had a great song called Teach Your Children, which was an anthem back then. And so that's my message, you know. We operate at the family level. Sadly, there are no great leaders to look around and find anymore on the planet. So you are the leader. It's the family unit. And you set an example at home in a smaller way, as large a way as possible, but teach the children, and organically it will happen. Teach the children. Thank you.
Thank you, Farouk. Thanks. So the participants have been shouting out thank yous. There was one particular ask about what our topic will be in 5 or 10 years or 20 years. Maybe we won't even be here because the problem will be solved, but I suspect we'll just be talking about different things, or the same things, but a different angle. Next year, this will be hosted, this global forum will be hosted in the United States. Hopefully we'll see each other there, but we're now officially out of time. So I would like to say, please join me in, first of all, thanking all of you, all of the amazing, absolutely amazing panelists for joining us today. But also thank the audience for being here with us, for asking giving us tips and asking questions and sending us links. And finally, thank the organizer Prime and the Secretariat High Tier, who is here to help make sure that everything, we would have not be able to start this session without his help. So thank you, everybody. And I hope that we'll see each other in person very soon.
And a big thank you to you, Rose. Thank you.
Indeed, well said.
Thank you.
It's my honor, my pleasure. Enjoy the rest of the forum.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.